Thanks, everybody, for sticking around. I think this is one of the most important panels of the day, and we're going to march through this, get great content, and go to our martinis, and they're close. So hang in there. But this is really critical to any scalable digital health solution. So, Chris, I know that you're a farm boy from Wisconsin, but and I have a rabbi, but you're my new rabbi in cybersecurity, even though you're from, like, hog farm. So the reason you are, is that you have, you work for a regulated company, you have a deep knowledge of the potential of connected care, and we've shown that with you have many connected products at Abbott, but also have been faced with the first FDA advisory on cybersecurity. So you kind of took me on a journey that introduced me to all the people who play in this field. So can you just talk personally about how you view the space now? And then Sid and Josh, and I just would like everyone, Greg, our former FBI agent, to finish off with now working in Homeland Security. If you can just all sort of talk about where we are in digital health now and kind of how it works. So, Chris.
Sure. Thanks, first of all, for inviting me. I'm going to choose to believe that you're all here to listen about cybersecurity and not just because of the drinks that are going to come right after this. But I've worked now in IT security and healthcare for about 20 years. And one of the reasons that I've done that is because it's very personal. And as I've listened to people today and talked to people, one of the common themes that I've heard people talk about is that the different diseases and different issues have come up. Everybody has a connection. Everybody can say, I know somebody that has that, or I know that somebody that's dealing with that. And it was very personal for me today because about 2 hours ago, I got a text from my wife that said a very close family member had just gotten done with having an implantable defibrillator implanted. And he found out about that about a week ago when he went to see his physician. And they took a printout of his pacemaker, which he's had for about 7 years. And they asked him, what were you doing 2 or 3 weeks ago? And on a certain, they actually had the exact day. And he said, well, I was playing in a softball tournament. And they said, did you feel anything? And he said, yeah, I felt horrible. I didn't know I was out playing. And he actually was very upset with himself that he missed a fly ball. But he said, I didn't feel well, and I wanted to come on the game, but I stayed in. And they said, well, by your reading, your lower chamber of your heart was beating at 240 beats a minute. And so they said, you're going to be back in a week. We're going to put a defibrillator in. And, to me, that just shows, talking about it, not that many years ago, that probably would have resulted in, he probably wouldn't have known. He probably would have died shortly. But still, that was a month after it happened. And so listening to people talk today, you think about the opportunity of he's out on the field and something tells him right away that something's not right. You need to do something about that. So it's cool to me to listen to people talk about these opportunities in healthcare and the possibilities of saving people's lives, making people's lives better for our kids in the future. But key to that, and why we're on this panel, is that all that information that comes out of these devices, that comes out of these systems, we have to be able to trust it. When it tells us, you need to do something, we have to trust the integrity of that information. And we have to trust the availability of those systems. And so, to me, the other theme that I've heard today is collaboration and sharing and communication. And I think, we could talk about encryption and we can talk about technologies and cybersecurity, but similar to a lot of the other things we've talked about, it's a lot about partnerships and it's a lot about communication. And if I look at my job in security 5 years ago, I worked with a lot of security people. Now I split my time between regulators, physicians, hospitals, and other groups outside of the security space. And I think in working at Abbott, we believe this, and that's why we're doing a lot of things we're doing, is that it's going to take this collaboration and this partnership amongst all these people to solve this problem, because security it's an industry challenge in healthcare, and it's a challenge in every industry. I mean, in the last week, we've had major breaches of Equifax. The SEC just got hacked or found out about that the other day. So it's a challenge across all industries that we need to work together on.
So Sid, that kind of sets up what the governor's office is doing in health and cyber. Are you off? Here, we can share.
I think I'm on. Hold on.
Okay.
Am I on? That's right, Leslie. First of all, again, thank you for having us here today. I do want to say to the voice of God for the room, you did a great job pronouncing my last name. It's not an easy thing to do, so I have to acknowledge it. So, before I jump in on the health side, let me just take a quick macro perspective about why we're in this space in the first place. So, I represent the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, and our office is the state's lead agency when it comes to business economic development opportunities. And for us, when we look, and Chris alluded to this, when we look at our industries, the technology, the culture of innovation in California, which is going to be on the cutting edge of globally when it comes to everything from health to finance, across the board, to agriculture, you name it, digital innovation is part of that equation. And as we started to do our own analysis of the leadership's role that we want to take as we look at the future, we decided that cybersecurity, cyber resilience is a critical part of our role at the state to participate in that conversation with industry partners, with academia, and also with government at all levels. So I want to just kind of start there, and then to Dr. Saxon's point, we are engaging in a conversation with the center on how do we work with our industry partners together to think through what are those recommendations, what are the ways that our large, mid-size, small businesses are thinking about and acting on cyber security and cyber resilience, frankly. So I want to talk more about that, but I'll turn it over to our other panelists.
Okay, Josh, I know you're much more than a hacker, but you're like the researchers, hackers are the key to this whole thing. So can you just explain how it works, how all the information flows around cyber threats?
Well, that's a pretty tall order. I'll do a piece of that. So I'm Josh Corman. I'm the director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at a nonpartisan policy think tank in D.C. But 4 years ago, in addition to that, which is really how I got here, I started a group of white hat hackers, good guys, focused on public safety and human life in the Internet of Things. So we like to say wherever bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. So we do connected vehicles, public infrastructure, cars, medical. And then over the last year and a half, I also served on the Congressional Task Force for Healthcare Cybersecurity, because it's our belief that our dependence on connected technology is growing much faster than our ability to secure it, and now it has consequences, including public safety, human life. But more importantly as well, because these innovations in theory save way more lives than they will ever take, it's also an economic stability and a crisis of confidence kind of an issue. If you look at connected medicine specifically, there's a promise and a peril to connected medicine. As someone who lost my mother a couple years ago to glioblastoma, we have these things we potentially, theoretically, could solve with precision medicine. So I desperately want these benefits to be realized. And if we're cavalier about these innovations, any exotic death could trigger a crisis of confidence that makes people no longer want a defibrillator or a pacemaker, or makes people no longer trust the data that we're gathering or surrendering. So to me, it's a very precarious balance. And today I heard a lot of fantastic promise, and we don't want to be the downers of the day, but we want to remind you that it takes collaboration and conscientious choices early to work with willing allies like my group. It's called I Am the Cavalry. The idea was the cavalry isn't coming. No one's going to come fix this. So it was a personal commitment for the hackers to be part of the solution. So I think I can say this very succinctly. People think hacker equals criminal, but not only are they not all bad, like there's good wizards like Gandalf and there's bad wizards. So there's good and bad, but even amongst the good guys, we have very different motivations, and they all start with a P. It won't be a quiz, but there's protectors that just want to make the world a safer place. There's puzzlers that do it for challenge and curiosity. They like to take stuff apart. There's prestige that do it for glory and ego and don't want to get a headline or a keynote. There's profit that do it to maybe advance their careers or stock, short of stock. There's protests to do it for against some ideological cause, but all within the bounds of the law. And at least for my part, I tried to create a group that was first and foremost protectors, and we tended to attract puzzlers as well. And look at us as almost the immune system of connected technology or the antibody response to something bad. And we're trying to be the adults in the room that can be a helping hand instead of a pointing finger. But we're in a very dangerous moment in history. Some of the task force members found, I'm going to say this also succinctly. We had a report everybody should read. It came out in June, but essentially the top 5 uncomfortable truths about hospitals, but they directly apply to the innovations discussed here today. Number 1, 85% of the hospitals in the U.S. lack a single security person on staff, not even one. Number 2, they're trying to defend really old, indefensible things like Windows XP and older that are just almost impossible to defend. Number 3, this is the one that scared me today when you brought up EHRs. Meaningful use as an incentive to digitize our records actually drove premature and over connectivity to the point where everything's connected to everything else in a way that was never designed to be. Which leads to number 4, like last February, Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital shut down patient care for a whole week due to an accidental compromise, and the WannaCry virus took out 65 hospitals in 4 hours in the UK, which is 20% of our national capacity. And then lastly, the average device has over 1,000 exploitable known vulnerabilities in it, over 1,000. So in that race to innovate, right, if you think of all the innovation and amazing ideas and concepts we discussed today, if innovation is the engine, confidence and trust is the fuel, and we can't afford to be running on empty. So I strongly encourage folks to understand and recognize willing allies from theoretical adversaries and really leverage this group of white hats that really want to be part of the solution. We want everything you want. We don't want to supplant your judgment. We want to inform and support it. And we're kind of running out of time. Things are pretty bad. And I fear one of those crisis of confidence moments because we are over-dependent on undependable things. And just to add one more quotable, I regret saying this to a certain extent, so I've tweaked it a little bit. But as you innovate here, one of the reasons the hospitals are so vulnerable in the UK is because we just assume connectivity is good. But what I tried to say as a bumper sticker you could remember is if you can't afford to protect it, then you can't afford to connect it. And everyone says there's no money in healthcare, we can't hire people, et cetera, but no one actually forced this level of connectivity. We have to look at the cost benefit of this. And since that offended some people, I'll channel my inner Stan Lee instead. With great connectivity comes great responsibility. So maybe that's a little less pejorative, but I remain deeply concerned about the relationship between technology and the human condition beyond cyber. But please, early and often, seek out willing allies to help. I think we can get everything we want, but we have to be very conscientious about our choices.
Thank you. Greg, we met in D.C., but you left a really cool job as an FBI agent. Why? To go to Homeland Security and sort of try to understand cyber risk, and then talk about Homeland's role in medical cybersecurity.
Sure. So I was an FBI agent for 8 years. I used to do national security intrusion hacking, mostly stealing in military projects. So I did that, and we were always coming in after the fact, trying to put pieces together, figure out what happened, what was connected, that shouldn't have been connected, what credentials were used. And it was starting to get pretty depressing as far as, you always wrote these reports and, you're just watching things just get stolen left and right. And so I decided to move Department of Homeland Security. So my team, so I run a vulnerability team. We cover the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. So that is, a few of them are power, gas, water, any type of industrial control system. We assess devices as well as healthcare. So there's a health and human services aspect to that. And so what we do is historically, in some industries, still the case today, we also cover transportation with autonomous vehicles, positive train control, that researchers would call the vendor and say, we found something in your product, an issue, and the vendor would say, okay, let's talk to our legal team. And and try to threaten to sue the vendor or sue the researcher based on some terms of service issue, or that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. And so we historically 10 years ago started to be the buffer. So with the idea that we didn't want the researcher sued, we felt that the research was important. So we are the the go-between between the researcher and the vendor to negotiate, what is right and come up with a coordinated vulnerability plan to implement those mitigations. And so we're on more of the proactive side now, where we are looking at trying to figure out, so sometimes we have the researcher no knock on you guys, but some researchers, and we work with researchers all over the world, will call us and say, you know, we found the next vulnerability and this thing's going to kill tons of people. It's terrible. And then we have the company telling us this is no big deal. Don't even pay attention to this. We're not fixing it. And so we try to, I have a team and we assess the information from both sides and try to figure out what is actually accurate rather than taking one side or another. We don't have a financial motivation in it. We are the U.S. government. We're just trying to get the things patched. We are truly one of the entities within the U.S. government that is really just trying to help. But there is, I know, everybody laughs, but that is a challenge for us to overcome, mostly in these phone calls. But there are, in the healthcare space, there are plenty of healthcare vendors. I think we worked a couple hundred vulnerabilities in the healthcare space last year, so there are plenty of vendors that have worked with us and have had good experiences.
So how does it work? So a researcher, like Josh says, okay, there's a vulnerability in this, and you take that in and you assess it. You talk to the vendor, you're the go-between, and then the FDA is there. The FDA has got to assess the safety of products. How does that work then? How does that loop?
So we have zero regulatory authority. Actually, we have hardly any authority on this, and so we will talk to the vendor and ask if they would like us to share it with the FDA. But we do not have any FDA processes. We don't deal with any of the forms that they should or shouldn't be filled out, and so we will, with the vendor's permission, pass it to the FDA if needed. But we do not take any type of a regulatory stance or pass information that the vendor does not want passed.
So you're trusted by the researcher and the vendor.
Yes. So it's a completely a trust relationship. We don't pay the researchers. They just do it. We have a network of researchers that have worked with us for long periods of time, hundreds of researchers that we work with every year. Actually, just as many researchers are overseas in other countries than they are in the United States, and it's just a relationship. When we publish an advisory, we do credit the researcher for it, so we do give them credit for their research, but that is the only, I guess you could say, acknowledgement or compensation that they get.
So you'll issue a report if you think there is a significant vulnerability based on all that. So what happens if the FDA gets a hold of the information, thinks it's a vulnerability that's more significant than you think, for instance? They issue an advisory. Do you have any power to weigh in on that if you don't agree with that?
So we have a pretty good relationship with the FDA where we will do joint calls. So to fix those type of issues, we will get on the phone with recently, we have them all the time, where we have the FDA, us, the researcher, and the vendor, and we talk it out. And we, to the date, haven't had an issue where they issued something and we felt like, or vice versa, that we're typically on the same page as far as the cyber side of things. But I will caveat this: we don't comment on patient impact. That's not our deal. We look at the exploitability and what vulnerabilities exist in the devices. We let the vendor tell us how it's going to impact the patients because they're the ones that designed it. We can't have that type of visibility.
And Chris, can you just talk a little bit about how we have continuous quality improvement of people who make drugs or devices? They're always tweaking things that comes under the radar. What about continuous quality improvement in cyber? Can you just talk about good hygiene and go down the line and get your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure others can weigh in on this on many fronts, but there's many things. You think about pre-market activities for devices as they're being developed, and building security into the product, and then testing it. And there's lots of different types of testing, which I won't bore you with. So there's a lot on the pre-market side. And I think one of the things that is a challenge in medical devices is the life of a device. You look at, so the pacemaker that this family member of mine had, he had it for 7 years. I think they started designing it in the early 2000s. So this is a 15-year-old device, which longevity is great from a patient's perspective. It means they're not back in the hospital. It means they're not missing work. It means the device is working, which is good. but it presents a unique challenge in how do you then, keep that device secure going forward. And so that gets into the post-market side of it, which, continues with the testing and working and partnering with, people within the company, but also people outside the company. We partner with many different security researchers and actively work with them and getting lots of different perspectives on the security of the products. And then when things are discovered, working with folks like Greg from ICS CERT and customers to figure out what's the right way to fix those devices in a safe and effective way.
In addition to what's been said, as of last year, the FDA put out their post-market guidance. Now, the Cavalry put out a document. We call it the Hippocratic Oath for Connected Medical Devices. It might be very good for the folks in this room. And it essentially said as technology increasingly plays a role in the delivery of modern care, the devices should also symbolically understand the do no harm kind of principle. So we said, when I explained it to my neighbor, I said, all systems fail. Here's 5 ways you need to handle failure. Number 1, what do you do to avoid failure? Number 2, do you take help avoiding failure without suing the helper? Number 3, do you capture, study, and learn from failure? Do you have a way to contain and isolate failure? And do you have a prompt and agile way to inoculate against future failure? And in some very flowery language, we've tried to push those through the FDA for their pre-market guidance about bringing things to market in the first place, but also post-market. And I think as a post-market, it's changed the dynamic that's been described. The FDA strongly wants you to have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program working with white hat hackers like ourselves proactively. And they essentially created a carrot-shaped stick so to Bakul's point this morning about not wanting to have tons of permission every step. The idea was if a bug's reported to you and you can mitigate it in 30 days or fix it within 60, they don't need to get involved. You can handle it yourself. So to a certain extent, it lets you preordain your destiny. If you're prepared to receive and respond to failure, that's a really good thing. So it's not perfect, it's not seamless, but we're trying to make sure that the right teamwork between the various stakeholders can maybe make this a very well-oiled machine. And as you go to your software, permissionless software products, I would certainly strongly encourage that we look at those 5 things as indicators of a mature program.
So my only complaint, Greg, about my little year foray into this is that it's great. All the experts, the researchers, it's open. I don't know. It could only happen in a democracy, so it's really super, super great because they're all these, state-sponsored cyber. But I just feel like as a clinician, you guys really need some more doctors because the one thing the researchers, and it doesn't seem like Homeland really has to me, is the ability to really understand the theoretical risk because we're scaring the hell out of people with stuff implanted in their body. And we should be cautious and we want to be safe. But what we know is a lot of connectivity saves a lot of lives. And I'm worried, and I'm even worried that the threats aren't that great. But what do I know? We're really dependent on you guys. And like, as Chris said, we're pushing on device companies to make devices that last 15 years. And because they save money and we know connectivity. So it's just a really hard, like if you tell me there are 1,000 vulnerabilities in a device, to me that's like, don't say that publicly because that's going to scare the hell. But I know there are. How many are significant?
So
how do we figure that out?
Yeah. And you and I talked about this on the prep call. I actually hate hearing there's 1,000. It turns out the guy that fixed that, it was an end-of-life device. There were 1,418 vulnerabilities. It turned out updating 7 packages fixed them all. So don't get overwhelmed just because you hear 1,000 doesn't mean they're all going to kill you because obviously we haven't had high-profile deaths. But now that what we're seeing with the WannaCry attack, 1 vulnerability took out entire hospitals for a couple days. So we don't want to be cavalier and say 1,000 is so many, we'll just blow it off. What we want to do is be very diligent about which ones are optional, elective, and which patterns of behavior make sure we get all the benefits of the technology.
Okay, so in terms of all the products we talked today and all the cyber risks, just let's go down the line. What keeps you up at night? What's the most vulnerable part of the medical, this whole continuum? Greg will start and go up. What's the nightmare? What's the most vulnerable thing that?
So I think that, so we do on-site assessments every year. We do a couple hundred of them, not just in the medical sector, but all over. And we see the same findings every year. And it's always that boundary protection comes up as the biggest issue as far as devices are hanging directly off the internet. You can scan, you can find them, you can see what version of firmware they're using, and you could just Google that and start logging into devices. And so I think that those are very easy things that can be implemented, but in a medical setting, we're still not getting devices from hanging directly off the internet. So it's something like that, you can cause great harm with very little
So
skill
would that
or
be
knowledge.
an IV pump in a hospital right now, an antiquated connected IV pump that could happen, then you could deliver a dose of something?
So yeah, so we've found MRI machines. I mean, you can. So there's a couple, websites that you can go and search, and you can find hundreds of devices and you can search by device type and see exactly how they're implemented. And I know that from a vendor perspective, I mean, there's not much you can. From the hospital side, they should be implemented, with their IT folks. But if they don't have IT folks to implement them, or if it's on contract, we're not seeing them integrated correctly or securely, I guess you could say.
Great. Josh?
We did the first ever clinical hacking simulation in Arizona a couple months ago. It was in early June. It's called CyberMed Summit, if you want to see the videos. We did 3 hacked devices with ER physicians that didn't know what was going on. The one that was the scariest for television was the pacemaker defibrillator, and it was really dramatic. But the one that keeps me up at night is the bedside infusion pumps. They're everywhere. They're highly connected. They're very vulnerable, and they can empty a lethal dose of the bolus pretty easily. And getting one gets them all because they share libraries. So to me, that's the absolute most scariest device. But then we also did a tabletop exercise the following day. It turns out the electronic health records, EMRs, are so vulnerable. And when you take them out, a lot of the new students aren't even trained to ever fill out a paper record. So the idea of just falling over paper backups, they've kind of transcended them. So if you want to do the most damage to the clinical environment, it would be electronic medical records. And they tend to be very poorly secured.
I'll tell you, what keeps me up at night when I'm thinking about this work is everything that I've already heard from these 2 panelists. Because at the end of the day, a breach that really gets a story from the Los Angeles Times can have a huge impact on what our legislators will do to actually kind of say, okay, wait a minute, now we have to swing this way and create so many curbs so much that it will suffocate some of the new technologies that we really need for better health outcomes. And as the agency representing like business and economic development that's looking to encourage these new technologies in partnership with our healthcare providers, that's the last thing I want to see, right? So that's what's keeping me up at night, and why I think government really needs to be a partner with you in these conversations. Because if we're there at the front end, if the GoBiz is there at the front end with you, we can be having conversations with the legislators in Sacramento. We can kind of start to cushion what those kinds of negative reactions could be. Of course, they are important, but I just want to make sure that we have a balanced approach to what that actually looks like, and proactively engaging kind of state government is a very important part of that.
Great. I know we've got a representative from Senator Harris's office here. Did you want to say anything just about the role of government in?
All the way on the spot. I like it. Hi, everyone. My name is Brent Robinson. I work for Senator Kamala Harris. She sits on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the Committee for Homeland Security and Government Affairs. So she receives regular briefings and commends service of guys like Greg on a regular basis. So thank you, Greg. I think really, really simply, one of the things that's most important on behalf of the senator is just that she's constantly looking into all these issues and how it is that we should be responding and building an infrastructure around cybersecurity that hasn't existed before. Obviously, the whole purpose of this panel is to bring that awareness to the medical community, right? To talk about the fact that, hey, this is something that needs to be addressed at a collective level, to have that conversation that government needs to be at the beginning of this conversation, to have that conversation of, let's bring everyone in, let's bring in white hats, let's bring in everyone to work together to make sure that we can solve a lot of these issues. And also understanding the impact that it would have on states like California. Many of you guys may already know that 40% of the entire imports into the country and goods into the country comes through the port of Los Angeles. The entire country. Obviously, if you have cybersecurity issues that end up affecting our larger infrastructure, especially at times of a lot of the recent natural disasters that may have happened. Imagine if there was a cybersecurity issue at a hospital in Mexico immediately after the earthquakes have hit, right? So these are the types of things that we want to make sure that we are prepared for, and these are the things that we want to make sure that we are all working together to find solutions around.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you
Oh.
to each of these excellent panelists. What a fascinating conversation. That could have gone on for a couple of hours. Let's say thank you to this group
Thanks.
of panelists.
Thank you very much.